Skyrim was living through a unique era. Its hero, the Dragonborn, besides perpetuating his lineage with Serana, now human again, had become the High King of Skyrim. Of course, Tamriel was already beginning to reap the fruits of this new time. Alliances forged, enemies defeated. Only the occasional undesirable event occurred, but nothing too serious. Everything seemed strangely peaceful. For the Dragonborn, his time as High King was numbered, since his lineage was safe thanks to his son Oren Yolviig. However, nothing is more dangerous for a king than the boredom of the throne. On some of his walks through his kingdom, he couldn't help but observe the Dwemer ruins. Especially, one of them quite peculiar. In the ruins of Beethalft, the existence of the Ethereum Forge was known to him. He had opened it years before becoming High King, which sparked curious glances there. But something was calling him. He went alone, yet ever since leaving Windhelm he could feel an unusual energy emanating from there. Something even he had never felt before. When he arrived at the forge, it appeared untouched. Even the remains of the Forge Master were still there. However, as he approached the forging chamber, he encountered Calcelmo, the court mage of Markarth, a man highly obsessed with studying the Dwemer. When questioned by the Dragonborn, Calcelmo explained that he had decided to visit the forge to conduct experiments with Ethereum itself. These experiments were releasing energies that beings like the Dragonborn could feel from miles away, since Ethereum is an extremely unstable magical material. Calcelmo, however, claimed to know every property of Ethereum, but had sensed an unusual disturbance within it, as if the minerals themselves were alive. The Dragonborn judged the experiments too dangerous and ordered Calcelmo to end them. But the mage insisted that he might be on the verge of the discovery of the century. Hearing this, the High King interrupted the experiments and intimidated Calcelmo, leaving the Dragonborn standing near the mage's instruments. However, accidentally, the Dragonborn destroyed some of those instruments while trying to drive Calcelmo away. Tools that were extracting energy from an Ethereum crystal the mage had in his possession. This created a massive instability in the chamber as the crystal shattered into two pieces, releasing a wave of energy throughout the entire forge, striking both the Dragonborn and Calcelmo. And everything went dark. When he opened his eyes again, he felt the cold, damp sand beneath his hands. The wind blew strongly from the sea, carrying a salty scent he had never smelled before. He stood up slowly. The horizon was strange. Dense forests stretched into the distance, while dark cliffs rose along the coast. The cold reminded him of Skyrim, but this land was definitely not his kingdom. Before he could explore further, voices arose behind him. When he turned, he saw armed men descending a small cliff. They wore thick fur cloaks and carried spears and swords. On their shields was the symbol of a gray wolf. They stopped a few meters away. The leader of the group spoke firmly, clearly demanding an explanation. The Dragonborn answered, but in his own language. Neither side understood the other. The soldiers exchanged suspicious glances. To them, that man had simply appeared on the coast as if he had fallen from the sky itself. After a few tense moments, the leader made a decision. He ordered the stranger to be taken with them. The Dragonborn could easily resist, but he realized something important. If he wanted to understand what was happening, he needed to allow it. Hours later, after crossing cold forests and snow-covered paths, the group arrived at a large fortress surrounded by ancient walls. One of the soldiers points to the place and tells the Dragonborn a name: Winterfell. The gates opened and the strange prisoner was led into the courtyard. Servants and guards stopped to observe him. Soon, firm footsteps echoed across the stone. A dark-haired man with a serious look approached, accompanied by some guards. He looks at the Dragonborn with immense distrust, but there is no trace of fear on his face as he gazes at the strange man. Pounding his chest as if to identify himself, he says his name: Jon Snow. But before the two warriors could exchange more meaningless words, a familiar figure emerged from the crowd. Speaking in their native tongue, he calmed Jon Snow and turned to the Dragonborn, revealing his face in great relief. It was Calcelmo. The elf greets his king with joy, though he doesn't know how it all happened. He says that undeniably the Ethereum explosion also affected him, and that it supposedly created a tear in reality, a distortion in space-time. He goes on to explain that he inexplicably appeared on the beaches 5 years ago. For some reason, the Dragonborn had only arrived now. Calcelmo hadn't lost his thirst for knowledge, and during those 5 years, he had learned many things about this world, including its native language, kingdoms, geography, and even magic. However, he still hadn't discovered how or why they arrived in that world. And worse, there wasn't even evidence of how they could return home. But despite this, he could pass all this information on to the Dragonborn, and better situate him within this new reality. He pulls a large map from his robe and shows it to his king. The parchment revealed a vast continent filled with mountains, rivers, and human kingdoms, all vying for power and influence in a land called Westeros. Calmly, the elf began to situate his king in this new world. He explained that Westeros was ruled by great noble houses that dominated different regions of the continent. To the north stretched the immense territory known as the North, ruled by the ancient House Stark, the same house that had welcomed Calcelmo after his unexpected arrival 5 years earlier. Further south existed other powerful kingdoms, commanded by rival families such as House Lannister, House Tyrell, House Martell, and the ancient House Targaryen. However, none of these disputes represented the true threat of that world. With his finger, Calcelmo slid to the far north of the map, where a huge line crossed the continent from coast to coast. That colossal structure was known as the Wall, a gigantic ice wall erected thousands of years before to contain the horrors that inhabited the lands beyond it. It was then that the tone of the explanation changed. During his years in Westeros, Calcelmo had discovered the existence of ancient creatures capable of raising the dead and marching with armies of ice, reminiscent of the necromantic aberrations of Skyrim. They were called White Walkers. Many in that world believed they were just legends, but the elf knew they were real. It was during an expedition beyond the wall that the incident that would change everything occurred. At that time, Calcelmo still carried with him one of the fragments of the Ethereum crystal, the same mineral whose explosion had torn reality apart in the Forge of Beethalft. However, during a chaotic confrontation in the frozen lands of the north, the creatures reacted immediately to the presence of the fragment, as if drawn to its energy. In the chaos of the battle, the fragment ended up being lost, and everything indicated that he hadn't simply been buried by the snow. He had been carried away. Since then, Calcelmo had feared that the White Walkers had realized the hidden power in that mineral. If they managed to understand or manipulate the energy of the Ethereum, the consequences could be far more devastating than any war fought between the kingdoms of Westeros. It was then that the Dragonborn silently removed the second fragment of the crystal from his pocket and showed it to the mage. The Ethereum had split in two during the explosion. One fragment remained with the Dragonborn. The other, originally with Calcelmo, had now been lost in the frozen lands beyond the wall. Faced with that revelation, Calcelmo understood that perhaps it was no coincidence that his king had been brought to that world, and that most likely, if they reunited the two fragments of the crystal, there might be a remote chance of them returning to their world. Perhaps the fate of that conflict was not in the hands of the kings of Westeros, but rather of a warrior from another world, the only one capable of facing forces that transcended the very boundaries of reality. The conversation between the two is abruptly interrupted when a messenger reports strange invasions and massacres near the wall to Jon Snow. Despite his prior distrust, he looks at the Dragonborn as if requesting his help, as a vote of confidence. Calcelmo mediates the interaction and departs with the two warriors, along with a small detachment of Stark soldiers. Arriving there, apparently, there is nothing. Not even dead bodies were found in the surrounding villages, only empty houses as if the people had vanished into thin air. But suddenly, a group of Draarg-like beings with white skin and blue eyes rises from the snow and begins to attack the men. Calcelmo runs behind the Dragonborn, who fiercely attacks the enemies. But they didn't stop appearing. As if they were the snow itself, several rose from it unexpectedly. Not even Jon Snow had seen such a feat from these enemies. It was as if they were more powerful. But in the middle of the battle, the Dragonborn shouts. The men are stunned, and for a moment they didn't know if they were more afraid of the White Walkers or that strange warrior. His power throws the enemies away, and the Dragonborn advances and defeats them. Jon Snow, at the end of the battle, watches in surprise as the unknown hero approaches him and extends his hand as if in an act of gratitude. Regardless of the universe, the men of the North know how to treat each other. However, in the distance, the Dragonborn sees familiar silhouettes in the sky. Dragons, 3 of them flying towards him. Strangely, only he adopts a defensive posture, while the others look at him with bewilderment. Calcelmo addresses his king, telling him to calm down. He didn't know how to say this to the Dragonborn, so he let the circumstances speak for themselves. The 3 dragons approach the men, with a woman on the back of one of them. Upon landing, she dismounts, greets Jon Snow with an intimate and unusual tenderness, nods to Calcelmo with a slight smile, and turns to the Dragonborn, serious. He looks at the woman, almost ignoring her, as his attention rests on the dragons. The Dragonborn senses something strange coming from them, not as if there was something wrong with these dragons, but he didn't feel the mark of Akatosh on these creatures. Dragons that weren't children of Akatosh? This was the biggest novelty of this new world for him. But strangely, the woman calls him Dovahkiin. With a surprised face, the Dragonborn deduces that Calcelmo had taught her some of the language of the dragons of Skyrim, and it is with this language that the woman communicates with the Dragonborn. She introduces herself as Daenerys Targaryen, Mother of Dragons. In her native tongue, she explains to everyone that she was drawn to that battle by a particular power that resounded like a great shout. With Calcelmo's explanation, Daenerys partially understands the origin of that strange warrior, which made things even more worrying. She also states that Drogon, her dragon, had seen parts of the wall crumble, as if they were being attacked by something powerful from behind. If the fragment of the crystal was being used by the White Walkers, this demanded an urgent response. But while they were talking, a loud bang was heard. Looking towards the wall, the group sees from afar that a piece of it had fallen, creating a corridor in the middle of it, and an army could pass through there at any moment. Immediately, the Dragonborn says that such a threat needs to be stopped there, but Jon Snow interrupts, saying that it would be suicide to remain in that place. Daenerys then suggests that everyone retreat to Winterfell again, and that she will fly throughout Westeros, summoning help from the north. With the decision accepted, Calcelmo, the Dragonborn, Jon Snow, and the rest of the soldiers return to Winterfell. But upon returning, the Dragonborn feels that the piece of crystal he carries begins to shine brighter and tremble, as if the other half were getting closer and closer. For him, It indicated that the war was indeed beginning. With the battle against the White Walkers in the Northern Kingdom over, the misty plains were filled with fear as well as blood. As they prepared to return to Winterfell, the Dragonborn and Jon Snow saw that the bodies they had fought were human, just like them. They had never been White Walkers. But how? They had looked their enemies in the eye. But setting aside their astonishment, they returned to the city, remembering their missions. Daenerys was now flying to all the kingdoms of Westeros to convince them of the real threat from the north. Jon Snow and the Dragonborn, meanwhile, were to prepare the few remaining men for a possible great battle approaching with the breach in the wall. But what about Calcelmo? The High Elf had isolated himself in his home. Somehow he felt guilty about it all. If he hadn't found the crystal in Skyrim, if he hadn't tried to unravel its secrets, and worse, if he hadn't let its fragment fall into enemy hands. But upon being visited by the Dragonborn, his king and now his friend, Calcelmo reveals to him the origin of the Ethereum crystal. Calcelmo took advantage of the period of peace in Skyrim after the Dragonborn became High King there. In this way, he felt free to explore the Dwemer ruins of Skyrim and Morrowind on his own. As a result, in his various excursions, he discovered clues to a lost artifact attributed to the Dwemer themselves. It was as if the Dwemer wanted to create a kind of Daedric artifact. His coordinates led directly to Blackreach. Upon arriving there, Calcelmo deactivated and broke the sun in the Great Cavern, revealing within it the hidden crystal. Obviously, seeking to unravel the properties of that material, Calcelmo went to where it had most likely been created, the Ethereum Forge. There, days later, he received a visit from the Dragonborn, which would lead to the accident that tore reality and brought them here. Although the Dragonborn's words tried to comfort and bring peace to his friend's guilt-ridden heart, Calcelmo knew that, in addition to all this, there was now the danger of a powerful army marching towards them. The Dragonborn then, before leaving Calcelmo's dwelling, promised the elf that he would take them back to Skyrim very soon. And also, he left Calcelmo the other fragment of the Ethereum crystal, because if he were lost in battle, the enemy would have the complete crystal. Upon returning outside the city, Jon Snow called him to battle. He had received information that an unknown army had passed through the walls and lined up to the north. There was no other alternative. Even with few and weak men, Jon Snow and the Dragonborn gathered what little they had and marched back to the wall. But upon reaching the field, the shock was immense. The Dragonborn had studied the history of the ancient peoples of Tamriel, so he knew who was standing before them. On the other side, the enemy army gathered. Dumak, king of the Dwemer. The Snow Prince, ruler of the Snow Elves, and Ysgramor, leader of the Atmorians, were there, leading their respective armies. The Dragonborn, Jon Snow, and the soldiers of House Stark saw in detail the bearded faces and golden armor of the Dwemer, the gleam of the skin and white spears of the Snow Elves, and the size and physical imposing presence of the Atmorian men. How is this possible? Was the only thought that lingered in the Dragonborn's mind. But there was no time to lose. They had to fall now. Jon Snow defeats Ysgramor with remarkable ease. The Dragonborn fights the Snow Prince and easily defeats him. Dumak is defeated by the soldiers. Overall, the enemies fought in a very rudimentary way, giving the Dragonborn a constant feeling of anguish and unease. The battle was strangely easy. The Dragonborn knew that those peoples possessed relentless power. This ease in defeating them made no sense at all. But then, as a flashback, the Dragonborn sees a scene of horror again. Men, women, children, farmers, miners, peasants, dead on the battlefield. The spears of the Snow Elves, rakes, the axes of the Atmorians, wood-chopping axes, the swords of the Dwemer, hunting knives. There were no Atmorians, Dwemer, or Snow Elves. Just another grand illusion. Some Stark soldiers had fallen mad. For certain people fallen, there were their own family. Jon Snow turns to the Dragonborn and says he has never seen such power in Westeros. If the Night King could conjure this, he couldn't even imagine what he might be capable of now. Before the Dragonborn could respond, Calcelmo arrives on the battlefield, breathless as if he had run desperately to catch up with them. He is shocked by the scene of carnage, but says that while the Dragonborn marched into battle, he studied the fragment his king had given him and discovered that the crystal fragments were creating a kind of resonance between themselves. In this way, Calcelmo saw everything the Night King was doing with his fragment. The White Walkers kidnapping people, forcing them to serve the Night King, and using the power of the Ethereum crystal to cast an illusion spell on them. Calcelmo further claims that the Ethereum mineral may contain traces of memories from all the peoples who have come into contact with it. Therefore, the Night King could have known the ancient peoples of Tamriel and used their images in this mass illusion. In some unknown way, the Night King had discovered how to use the power of the fragment. But if he had the other half, which was now with Calcelmo and the Dragonborn, he could assume a power that would give him the possibility of dominating not all of Westeros, but perhaps even tearing reality apart again, and trying to dominate other universes, including Tamriel itself. Upon hearing this, the Dragonborn's heart pounded, but not from fear, but from feeling something within him change. The desire to save Skyrim from the dragons had motivated him. Now, that same desire took root within him to save Westeros. Listening in the distance, he heard the sound of Daenerys' dragon's wings approaching, but he felt something more. The hearts of those dragons, even from a distance, he felt as if they were beating within himself. Over time, an allied army emerged there. Daenerys Targaryen succeeded in her mission. To aid House Stark, forces gathered from different parts of Westeros. House Targaryen led with its dragons, accompanied by allies from houses Greyjoy and Martell. Even houses that had previously resisted, like the Lannisters, began to recognize the gravity of the threat. Not all came out of loyalty. Some came out of fear. This gives the men a reason for relief. But for the Dragonborn, his feelings for dragons take a new turn. Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion gather around him, bowing their heads in reverence. They still maintain their respectful posture towards Daenerys as their mother. But in the Dragonborn, they have chosen an alpha out of respect. He wouldn't need to use shouts like "Bend will," as the dragons had become one with him. Voices, feelings, desires. The Dragonborn felt everything from those creatures within himself. Then, in an almost telepathic impulse, the Dragonborn orders them to fly over the wall and identify a new possible attack. Meanwhile, Calcelmo reveals that the Night King made this illusory attack to buy time, since his real objective is to break the enchantment that prevents him from crossing the wall, using Ethereum. In the north, the Dragonborn sees with the eyes of the three dragons. He sees vast plains, frigid, bone-crushing temperatures. Even so, he orders the entire army to attack, even before the enemy attacks, to surprise the Night King in his own territory where he least expects to be attacked. But when questioned by Calcelmo and Jon Snow about the impossibility of men surviving the climate of the far north, and their inability to face the White Walkers on equal terms, the Dragonborn asks for the Ethereum fragment back. He states that if the Night King can use the powers of the half of the crystal in his possession, he himself can also use his own. Holding the fragment in his hands, the Dragonborn feels his Nord ancestry pulsing in his veins, the blood of the dragon and the blessing of Akatosh screaming within him. And as if he could access the ancestral memories of the Ethereum, he sees new words in his mind.
Lo sé, las, lavu.
His shout strikes the armies of Westeros with an absurd wave of life. Waves of vitality surge in the hearts of men. No dark magic of death could overcome them like the Night King's illusions, and their bodies became resistant to any challenge, including the cold of those lands. They look towards the breach in the wall and rush towards it. The attack on the frozen lands had indeed begun. The Dragonborn, mounted on Viserion, attacks the enemies from above alongside Drogon and Daenerys. Jon Snow and Rhaegal clear the way for the Alliance armies on the ground. This would perhaps be the greatest war ever to happen in all of Westeros. Perhaps it would take years to conclude. But here, perhaps the Dragonborn could offer greater help by shortening that time frame. The main objective? To defeat the Night King. Victory after victory, the conquest was achieved successfully, albeit slowly. However, when the battle seemed to be heading towards a possible long-term victory, the Dragonborn sees through Viserion's eyes to the north, thousands of White Walkers crossing the frozen continent to reinforce the enemy, led by the Night King himself. This war was far from over. The war lasted for days, and it didn't seem like things would end well for the Allies. Unlike before, the Dragonborn and Jon Snow were no longer fighting illusions created by the fragment of Ethereum in the Night King's possession. The lands to the north offered a powerful challenge against the humans. The Dragonborn, fearing to cause an irreversible impact on this world, tried to restrain his powers along with Calcelmo's guidance. The enemy was fierce. It was as if the White Walkers were the Night King himself, now strengthened by the magic of the Ethereum crystal. The Dragonborn feared that the continuous and excessive use of the two fragments could cause an unprecedented catastrophe, perhaps on a multiversal scale. Calcelmo, although he knew a little about the properties of the crystal, was no match for controlling its power. However, as he came to the rear of the army to align strategies with Calcelmo, the world around the Dragonborn seemed to stop for a moment. In his head, he heard some voices. Familiar. Identifying himself as Master Neloth, the voice speaks directly to the Dragonborn, showing relief at finally being able to contact him after so long. Along with Neloth's voice, the Dragonborn could also hear the happy voice of Arngir, the elder friend of the Greybeards. They, through the memories held by the Ethereum crystals, knew about the Night King and the entire war in that strange land. Both speak to the Dragonborn, giving instructions to bring him back to Tamriel along with Calcelmo. Neloth possessed a fragment of Ethereum so small it resembled a grain of sand, found in Nichardak. Joining forces with the Greybeards, the Masters created an artifact in Tel Mithryn, uniting the power of the voice with Ethereum. This artifact would function as a dimensional bridge that would pull the Dragonborn from his location and force his retreat back to Skyrim. However, Neloth states that he couldn't take them from there without the crystal being complete again. In other words, it was imperative that he defeat the Night King and take back the fragment. Upon returning to reality, the Dragonborn reveals his vision to Calcelmo, who, besides being euphoric, says he will return to Winterfell and work on a device that could hasten the end of the war. Mounting Viserion again, the Dragonborn flies back to the battlefield to rejoin Jon Snow and Daenerys. Returning to the rear to seek news of Calcelmo, the Dragonborn finds his wizard friend pushing a kind of catapult with Stark soldiers. Setting aside the strangeness, Calcelmo states that this device was still a prototype created some time ago, when he possessed the fragment of the Ethereum crystal. It was made to identify and locate the other part of the fragment. In other words, Calcelmo had created a tracker that could take the Dragonborn behind enemy lines, directly to the Night King, in a surprise attack. Not only the Dragonborn, the device could transport some soldiers continuously for a limited time. Gathering loyal and brave men, the Dragonborn presents himself before the Great Weapon, and is transported to the lands of the White Walkers along with them. In the Frozen Lands, if it weren't for the Dragonborn's shout that energized the soldiers, they would probably have frozen to their bones. But there, they fought as if their lives depended on it. And on the field, for the first time, the Dragonborn came face to face with the Night King. While the Dragonborn fought with his armies, Calcelmo informed Jon Snow of his plan, instructing him and Daenerys to attack with everything they had now that the enemy was weakened from within. And so it happened. The troops of the Westeros alliance managed to break through the enemy defenses and advanced with all their might towards the north. The Dragonborn managed to withstand the White Walkers' attacks, allowing the alliance troops an overwhelming advance. The Dragonborn's shouts struck the Night King with force, but he still resisted, using the power of his Ethereum crystal. He refused to surrender, but while he fought, the Dragonborn thought of his land, his kingdom, his wife, his son, his people. For them he fought, and for them he would die. But he couldn't die now. On the contrary, if the only obstacle to seeing his family again was the damned Night King, he should fall now. Enough holding back. Enough suppressing his power. Feigning retreat from the battle, the Dragonborn instructed everyone to retreat a little, and mounted Viserion again, and flew to an immense height. High above. For the first time, he draws energy from his fragment of Ethereum, feeling an overwhelming power within him. Deliberately, he throws himself from Viserion, falling from the sky, towards the Night King. When the Cursed King realized it was too late. The Dragonborn was falling directly above him with his mouth slowly opening.
Foos, Ra, Da.
The tremor was felt for miles. The surprise in the men's eyes was immense. If they hadn't known the Dragonborn as an ally, this would have been a reason to fear him. But from the immense crater, only the Dragonborn remained alive. Rescued by the soldiers, the hero awakened sometime later, with the 2 fragments of Ethereum in his hand. Calcelmo looks at them with contagious surprise and joy. The Night King's body was not seen, but the instant death of the White Walkers proves his defeat. The Alliance of Westeros was victorious. Little by little, the armies retreat from the frozen lands. Returning to where it all began, the Dragonborn, Calcelmo, Jon Snow, and Daenerys Targaryen reunite in Winterfell. The people, in great jubilation, praise the strength and power of what they called the Dragon God. However, the heroes knew what that victory had meant. Westeros, the strange land for the Dragonborn, had served as his home for a long time. A beautiful, powerful, and glorious land would now once again be under the complete control of its natives. Calcelmo, on the other hand, knew that their return meant that the crystal anomaly would finally end. Uniting the 2 fragments, the wizard contacts Neloth and Arngir and states that they are ready. The 2 sages then begin to operate their mechanism in Tel Mithryn, causing the Dragonborn and Calcelmo to slowly disappear in a cyan glow. Bidding farewell to his dragons, the Dragonborn says goodbye to Jon Snow and Daenerys. He was ready to return home. Upon waking, The Dragonborn and Calcelmo find themselves lying in front of Tel Mithrin in Solstheim. The mechanism had worked. They were finally back. The Dragonborn is reunited with Neloth and Arngir with great joy, along with Calcelmo. But despite the joy, new worries now arose. Neloth and Arngir didn't want to say anything until the Dragonborn was definitively back. For the real reason they went after the hero wasn't just a rescue, but a cry for help. Neloth then reveals that 10 years had passed since the Dragonborn and Calcelmo disappeared. Something that seemed like days to them. Putting the shock aside, Arngir instructs them to return to Skyrim now. And on the journey back to Skyrim, he updates his friend on what happened in the last decade. After his disappearance, the kingdom of Skyrim was in turmoil. Several revolutions and revolts plagued the holds, but the worst of them was a new Stormcloak rebellion. Led by former sympathizers of Ulfric Stormcloak's ideology, the Eastmarch Hold declared independence from the kingdom and annexed the Rift years later, creating an independent kingdom. Serana, the High Queen, made a fragile alliance with the Empire to halt the rebellion's advance. Later, betraying Skyrim, the Empire, which had established its troops in Falkreath due to its proximity to the border, annexed the Hold as a colony. During that war, the Pale and Winterhold, declared neutral, united in a coalition to protect themselves from the conflict. But incredibly, this wasn't even the biggest crisis. About 2 years after the Dragonborn's disappearance, all the elves of Somerset Isle simply vanished without a trace. Something similar to the disappearance of the Dwemer, but with something very different. As soon as the High Elves of Somerset disappeared, others appeared in their place, visibly disoriented and bewildered. They don't speak the language of Skyrim, nor the language of any of the peoples of Tamriel, past or present. They shut themselves off on the island of their own accord. No one enters and no one leaves. But before his isolation, Arngir says he spent a few days in contact with them. With his expertise in studying even the words of dragons, he and Neloth sought to translate their language to better understand everything. But of everything they tried to decipher from the words of those pale elves, only one phrase was repeated and remembered, and it was translated approximately as, "We no longer feel the grace of the valor."